Okay, so first off, we have Chapter 4.1, Geography of Egypt on the left. We have our homework due Wednesday on the right. And as we went over in class, section and page numbers are now required. So for all of these, since we're doing 4.1, we should have 4.1 for the section for all of these. The reason why I have you add the section is so you can just copy and paste it into the study guide when we make that at the end of the chapter. So go ahead and make all of these 4.1. We will add page numbers as we come across them. Okay, so let's begin. Egypt, built along a river. Where is Egypt located, and what are its major cities and rivers? Egypt is located in the northeast portion of Africa. It borders the countries of Libya to the west, Sudan to the south, and Israel to the northeast. The Mediterranean Sea lies to the north, and the Gulf of Aqaba is the east. Southern portion of Egypt lies almost on the Tropic of Cancer, or about 23 degrees latitude north. Most of the major cities in Egypt are located around 30 degrees longitude east. Latitude measurements refer to the north-south distances from the equator, and longitude measurements refer to the east-west distance from the prime meridian. Because Egypt is so close to the equator, its climate is generally warm all year. So, as we see over here, latitude and longitude definitions, you have them right there, and they give even little definitions for them here, but you can get more information from clicking on these blue links. Ancient Egypt was home to some of the earliest civilizations. These civilizations developed along the Nile River, the longest river in the world. The Nile is the most important feature of Egypt's geography, and it played a major role in the creation and development of Egyptian civilization. The river's journey, more than 4,000 miles to the Mediterranean Sea, begins in present-day Uganda on the northern shore of Lake Victoria. This southernmost portion of the river is known as the White Nile. As the river makes its way north, it is joined in present-day Sudan by two more major tributaries, the Blue Nile and the Atbara River. The Nile and its delta make up one of four geographic regions in Egypt. The others are the Western Desert, the Eastern Desert, and the Sinai Peninsula. So we have delta right here. That is another definition we're looking for. So for all so far, 1, 1. In ancient times, most of the population of Egypt lived in either Lower Egypt, the Nile River Delta, or in Upper Egypt along the Nile River itself. Farming was made possible in these areas because of the rich silt deposited by the river. Major cities as well as farming villages also developed along the Nile. The largest cities in ancient Egypt were Thebes, Memphis, and Giza. Today, Egypt is a busy modern country. However, the majority of its population is still located along the Nile River. In fact, the valley of the Nile is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Because Egypt is mostly desert, its climate is very dry with a little rain. In the desert, tropical wind from the south causes great sandstorms. There are two seasons, a sunny summer with high temperatures and a moderate winter with temperatures around 50 degrees. So that brings us to the end of page 1. We found 3 definitions, and we can see if we answered any questions. What is the most important feature of Egypt's geography? Why do you think that is? So if we come up here, it actually says that something here is the most important feature of Egypt's geography. You know what it is. And this information here will tell you why it's important. Actually, the majority of this section will tell you why it's important. get anything else here? What are the two endpoints of the Nile River? Well, they kind of tell you the start of it. Over here, the river's journey ends in Uganda. Way up. Okay, so we're looking for the two endpoints of the Nile River. In what direction does it flow? And we're also looking for papyrus and command economy. So, page 2, the Nile River. What are the unique features of the Nile River? Nile River forms in Khartoum, Sudan, at the meeting place of the White Nile and Blue Nile rivers. The White Nile provides the majority of the Nile's water. Okay, so here's your starting point for here. From Khartoum, the Nile flows northward to Egypt. At Cairo, the Nile fans out into its delta, a fertile area created by sediment from the river deposited as the river empties into the Mediterranean Sea. So it ends in the Mediterranean Sea and it flows northward. That will help you with this one. Now we're looking for how did the Nile River influence the growth of agriculture in ancient Egypt? Well, they start to talk about that already because it fans out into a fertile area. You know that fertile areas help with farming. As the Nile flows north through Egypt, it creates a thin strip of fertile land along its banks. This green, fertile land is in sharp contrast to the barren desert on either side of the river valley. The flooding of the Nile River occurs in a cycle with 3 seasons, as shown on the table below. So, Ahet is mid-June to mid-October, everything's flooded. Peret, mid-October to mid-February, water recedes, which means it goes away. Shomu, mid-February to mid-June, everything is dry. So, in the spring, heavy tropical rains in Ethiopia flood the Nile at its source. These floodwaters move north toward Egypt, carrying with them nutrient-rich soil, also called silt, from Ethiopian highlands. Ancient Egyptians called the Nile River Ar, or Ar, which means black, for the color of the silt it carried, as we went over in class. Every year, the Nile floods and silt-rich waters flows over the floodplain, the flat land around the river. When the water recedes, the silt that it carried gets left behind on the land. These silt deposits enrich the soil that fills the Nile River valley and delta, making them very fertile. Okay, on to page 3. We are looking for how did the Nile River influence the growth of agriculture in ancient Egypt? The river's bounty. How did the Nile River influence the growth of agriculture in ancient Egypt? That answer will be on this page. Ancient Egyptians took advantage of the Nile's cyclical flooding and its rich sediments. They began sowing seeds in the mud after the floodwaters receded. Eventually, in order to gain the greatest benefit from the Nile's waters, the Egyptians developed irrigation systems that carried water from the river to the plants in their fields. This right here helps you with that answer. These systems enabled Egyptian farmers to plant crops beyond the river valley and keep them watered all season. One of the earliest irrigation methods Egyptians used was called basin irrigation. Flat fields along the river were divided by mounds of dirt into basins, depressions that could hold water. Some of the basins were as large as 50,000 acres, 20,000 hectares. The basins would flood during the Akhet stage and remain flooded for up to 6 weeks, covering the field with giant puddles. The basins would drain when the river receded, leaving behind a thin layer of silt. During the Peret stage, Egyptians would sow crops in the basins. Later, farmers created irrigation canals. These canals allowed the farmers to grow crops further away from the river. Farmers used several tools to move water from the river or irrigation canals to their fields. One tool the Egyptians developed was a lever device called a shaduf. Shaduf made it easier for farmers to gather water and move it to their fields. Chief crops grown along the Nile River valley were wheat, barley, vegetables, and flax. Egyptians made bread and beverages from the wheat and barley, which were stored in large silos. They wove flax into linen. Another important crop in ancient Egypt was a reed called papyrus. Papyrus was a plant that could be made into paper-like writing material of the same name. Papyrus grew easily in marshes and was also used to make rope, matting, and sandals. Papyrus eventually became one of Egypt's most important crops. So we have papyrus here. So this is page 3. Egyptians also raised animals for food and to work the fields. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, ducks, and geese were common domestic animals. A particular breed of cattle was raised for meat, while another was used for milk. Egyptians also bred hunting dogs, as well as a type of flat-tailed sheep which they used for its meat and milk. On to page 4, we are looking for, since Egyptians were able to grow more food than they needed, they had a surplus. What were the effects of the food surplus? Growth of the states. How did agriculture influence the growth of civilization in ancient Egypt? Agriculture, irrigation, projects needed to sustain it were the foundations for early Egyptian civilization. The irrigation projects the Egyptians undertook required a lot of workers. Often, people from several towns or villages had to cooperate with each other in order to complete the necessary work. Leaders emerged to manage workers and supervise construction efforts. Historians have found evidence to suggest that organized governments began to take shape prior to the time of the pharaohs in 3000 BCE. However, since there are few written records before this time, not much is known about the details of that era. As the amount of farmland increased, so did the quantity of food. In most years, the Egyptians were able to grow more food than they needed. A surplus of crops enabled the Egyptians to work other jobs besides farming. The tradition-oriented economies became more complex as workers specialized and traded. The combination of growing governments and specialized workers led to the growth of towns. Larger towns came to rule over small villages and gradually grew into states. So we've already started to talk about what they did with the surplus. During the time of the pharaohs, managing agriculture was one of the most important jobs of the government. Viziers, whose powers were second only to that of the pharaoh, oversaw the central government, including running the Ministry of Agriculture. Other government officials were responsible for managing the fields or livestock. Later economists would call this government control of the economy a command economy. That brings us to our last definition on page 4. So in addition to writing the page numbers up here, I've put them along here as well. Eventually, Egyptians undertook large-scale irrigation works, such as building dams and long canals. They created basins to grow crops near the Nile River, using simple gates to control the flow of water, but the success of their new harvest depended on the Nile's annual flooding. One irrigation channel, called the Canal of the Pharaohs, was among the first that people could use for travel during flood periods. This canal was expanded over many centuries and eventually became the Suez Canal. By carefully controlling and managing their water sources, ancient Egyptian civilizations could yield plentiful crops, which increased their economic power and allowed larger cities to develop. Over time, the civilizations centered near the Nile River became great centers of power. By using improved irrigation methods, the Egyptians were able to grow a surplus of crops. Other civilizations, where farming was less successful, began to rely on Egypt for food and other goods that they needed. So this kind of hints to us what we should answer here, but I have a feeling more will be on page 5.